The courthouse steps were buzzing with the usual morning chaos, lawyers hurrying past, bailiffs scanning IDs, and the occasional protester waving signs demanding justice. Among the crowd stood a woman who, to most observers, seemed just another citizen navigating the labyrinth of the legal system. But there was something in her posture, a quiet, unwavering dignity that made her presence impossible to ignore. She was calm, collected, and observant, her eyes scanning every corner, noting every detail. That calm shattered in an instant. Officer Martinez, a man notorious in the precinct for his quick temper and reckless authority, shoved through the crowd with an air of entitlement. Without warning, his hand struck her face in a sharp, humiliating slap. The sound echoed off the courthouse walls, a sickening punctuation that silenced the murmurs around them. Shock rippled through the bystanders. A few gasped, others froze in disbelief, and one man muttered under his breath, "Did he really just do that?" Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, but her eyes remained steady, fixed on Martinez. She did not scream. She did not cry. The officers surrounding him barked orders at the crowd, demanding they move back, their voices attempting to mask the audacity of his actions. Witnesses murmured among themselves, some pulling out phones to record the incident, hoping their videos would serve as proof of what had just occurred. "Ma'am, you're under arrest," Martinez sneered, grabbing her arm with unnecessary force. Resisting arrest. She allowed herself to be handcuffed, the metal biting into her wrists, yet she remained composed. Each step she took into the courthouse was deliberate, measured, as though every move was calculated. Bystanders tried to follow, some hoping to intervene, others merely watching, horrified. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, a portal into a space that should have symbolized justice but now felt tainted by abuse of power. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Lawyers whispered hurriedly, their voices low but frantic, while court officers glanced nervously at the unfolding scene. Martinez smirked, thinking he had asserted dominance, that he had silenced her with a single act of violence. But he had no idea who she truly was. As she stood before the temporary judge, the courtroom seemed to shrink, every eye on her face, every whisper hushed. Martinez launched into his narrative, painting her as defiant, aggressive, and a threat to law enforcement. His colleagues nodded along, their faces a mixture of pride and fear, convinced of their righteousness. But she said nothing, listening, calculating, absorbing every word, every gesture, every lie. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. She allowed the courtroom to believe they were in control, to underestimate her. Behind the calm exterior, a storm was gathering, one that would turn the courthouse upside down within seconds. Every motion, every word of Martinez, only fueled her resolve. She could feel the cameras capturing every detail, every eye recording her restraint, and she made a silent note of it all. The slap had been public, meant to humiliate. But humiliation was a concept foreign to her. What mattered was truth, and the truth was coming, like a tide that could not be stopped. In that moment, on the marble floors of the courthouse, she became both observer and executor, patient and poised. Martinez might have thought he had the upper hand, but he had just set the stage for a reckoning he could never have imagined. And she waited, calm and steady, as the courtroom ticked forward, unaware that the woman before them was about to shatter the illusion of power they clung to so desperately. The courtroom had settled into a tense rhythm, each person playing their assigned role in a theater of authority. The officers, confident in their badges and procedure manuals, believed they had already won. Martinez, still smirking from the morning's incident, leaned into the podium as if the courtroom itself belonged to him. He began to speak, recounting the morning's events in a deliberate, exaggerated fashion. Every word was meant to paint her as violent, unruly, and unfit to navigate a civilized space. "Your Honor," Martinez began, his voice resonating with false authority, "the defendant resisted lawful arrest. She posed a clear and present danger. We acted in the line of duty to maintain order and safety." The temporary judge nodded, scribbling notes, eyes flicking occasionally toward the woman who had been slapped. To an outsider, it seemed routine, a clash between law enforcement and a citizen accused of minor transgressions. But the truth was far more complicated. She listened quietly, absorbing each lie, each mischaracterization, and each insinuation. Her mind raced, cataloging every detail. The officers believed they controlled the narrative, that their uniformed presence and authoritative tone were enough to secure the court's favor. But in reality, they were painting themselves into a corner, laying the groundwork for a spectacular unraveling. When Martinez paused for effect, she stood. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the center of the courtroom, her movements fluid and commanding. The murmurs began almost immediately, an audible shift in the room's energy. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing the gravity of what was about to happen. "I'd like to address the court," she said, her voice calm yet cutting through the room like a sharpened blade. Silence followed. The judge raised an eyebrow, the officers stiffened, and even the spectators leaned closer, curious about this unexpected turn. She recounted her version of events, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity and precision. She described the morning's encounter, emphasizing the unprovoked slap, the humiliation, and the abuse of power. Every detail was backed by witnesses and recordings, which she had anticipated the officers would underestimate. The courtroom, once filled with self-assured authority, began to shift. Doubt seeped into the minds of those who had come to believe in Martinez's version. "You will notice," she said, holding up a phone with recorded evidence, "that my actions were always calm, composed, and lawful. The officer's behavior, however, violates not only court decorum but fundamental principles of justice." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Lawyers whispered among themselves, exchanging incredulous looks. The officers' faces betrayed their growing panic, realizing the situation had slipped from their control. Martinez's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation and disbelief. The temporary judge, previously passive, now leaned forward, scrutinizing the evidence. The air thickened with tension, a palpable mix of fear, surprise, and anticipation. The narrative had shifted. The power, once firmly in the hands of law enforcement, now teetered on the edge, vulnerable to her next move. She paused, scanning the room. Every eye was on her, every mind subconsciously acknowledging her authority. This was more than a courtroom dispute, it was a challenge to the established order, a moment that exposed the fragility of perceived power. And in that silence, she realized something remarkable. The court, which had seemed a place of strict hierarchy and control, was actually a stage. A stage where truth, preparation, and courage could upend expectations, where a single person, armed with clarity and resolve, could confront an entire system and emerge unbowed. The stage was set. The officers, the judge, and the spectators all waited, unknowing that the coming seconds would redefine what justice looked like in this room. The courtroom was suspended in a tense silence, the kind that makes every heartbeat feel amplified. The officers, once confident in their authority, now shifted uneasily in their seats. The temporary judge, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, glanced at her. The spectators leaned forward instinctively, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the judge's bench, her posture erect and unwavering. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, yet natural, as though she were reclaiming a space that had always been hers. The officers' protests were immediate but half-hearted, words stammered, voices strained, but she had anticipated this. "Please remain seated," she said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. "I assure you, I know exactly what I am doing." The judge hesitated. A temporary figure, appointed to fill a gap in the system, was not accustomed to challenges like this. Her presence, unwavering and commanding, disrupted the expected hierarchy of the courtroom. And for the first time, the judge questioned the solidity of her own authority in this scenario. She climbed the few steps to the bench, her eyes sweeping over the courtroom. The officers fumbled with legal jargon, attempting to assert dominance through rules and regulations. But the energy in the room had shifted. Authority was no longer defined by badge, title, or procedural manuals, it was defined by confidence, clarity, and moral force. Sitting at the judge's bench, she allowed herself a brief moment to absorb the power of the act. She wasn't there to intimidate or punish, at least not in the way the officers feared. She was there to restore balance, to remind everyone that justice was not a privilege reserved for those in uniform. It was a right, accessible to anyone who had the courage to claim it. "Now," she said, her voice firm but measured, "we will review the evidence objectively." She gestured toward the officers. "Your accounts will be scrutinized with the same rigor as mine. Every claim will be examined, every action questioned, and every piece of evidence considered without bias." The officers tried to interrupt, but she raised her hand. Silence fell instantly. The courtroom had shifted. It now recognized her as the arbiter, not because of her title, but because of the undeniable command she carried. She reviewed the recordings, witness statements, and procedural notes with meticulous attention. Each piece of evidence she presented earlier aligned seamlessly, highlighting the officers' misconduct and their attempts to manipulate the narrative. Every lie they had told unraveled under the weight of truth, and every attempt to assert authority was met with composed rebuttals. The temporary judge watched in stunned silence, realizing that this was more than a spectacle, it was a lesson. Authority without accountability was fragile, and truth, once asserted courageously, could redefine power structures in an instant. By the time she concluded her review, the officers were visibly shaken. The courtroom had shifted from a space of intimidation and control to a space of accountability and clarity. The spectators, previously on the edge of anxiety, now watched in awe as a single individual had rewritten the rules in real time. "I believe justice is served when truth is acknowledged and abuse is addressed," she said, standing. "Let this be a reminder, the law exists to protect all, not to shield the powerful from scrutiny." As she stepped down from the bench, she returned the seat to the temporary judge with a nod, calm, composed, and undeniably triumphant. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary, not a disruption, but a restoration. Not chaos, but order, grounded in courage and truth. And in that moment, the officers realized a harsh truth: authority was not about intimidation. It was about accountability. And sometimes, reclaiming justice required bold action, the kind that redefines everything in mere seconds. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the tension lingered in the air like a thick fog. Whispers echoed through the hallways, the kind that grow louder with every retelling. Spectators who had witnessed the scene replayed it in their minds, each recounting colored by shock, admiration, and disbelief. Outside, reporters began gathering, their cameras capturing every face, every gesture, and every unspoken question. For the officers, the aftermath was immediate and visceral. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by confusion and indignation. They had expected compliance, submission to their authority, but instead, they faced someone who challenged not only their actions but the very notion of unchecked power. Their badges, once symbols of unquestionable dominance, now felt fragile under the spotlight of truth. Meanwhile, she walked out of the courtroom with measured steps, her composure intact. There were no celebratory gestures, no self-aggrandizing moves, only a quiet dignity that drew attention effortlessly. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones extended, but she handled them with poise. "I acted to ensure justice," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't about defiance, it's about accountability. No one, regardless of title or position, is above the law." Her words resonated far beyond the walls of that courthouse. Social media erupted within minutes, videos of her courtroom takeover going viral. People from all walks of life shared their admiration, framing her actions as a symbol of empowerment, resistance, and courage. Memes and hashtags spread rapidly, #justice reclaimed, #courtroom queen, #accountability matters. The legal system, for its part, scrambled to respond. Lawyers, analysts, and law professors debated the legality of her actions, dissecting every nuance of courtroom protocol. Some criticized her, labeling it an unprecedented breach of procedure. Others praised her, emphasizing the moral imperative behind her defiance. Yet, even those who questioned the legality couldn't deny the undeniable impact. a single act had forced a moment of reckoning. Her personal phone began to buzz incessantly, friends, colleagues, and strangers alike, all reaching out with messages of support. But amid the excitement, she remained grounded, reminding herself that this was only the beginning. Accountability in the courtroom was just the first step. The larger battle against systemic abuse, the fight for fairness and equality, was far from over. Inside the courthouse, the temporary judge filed a formal report detailing the events and recommending a review of the officer's conduct. Administrative hearings were scheduled, and internal investigations began. The ripple effects of that single courtroom moment were already reshaping policies, forcing administrators to reconsider oversight and training. Yet, the public reaction mattered most. The footage of her calmly reclaiming the bench became a cultural touchstone, symbolizing empowerment against entrenched authority. Schools, community groups, and activists cited her actions as a teaching moment, a vivid example of how courage combined with strategy could challenge systemic injustice. By the evening, she returned home, exhausted but resolute. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was fading, replaced by reflection. She thought about the women and men who had faced similar abuses without the chance, or the means, to challenge authority. Her action, bold and unorthodox, was more than personal, it was collective. In the quiet of her living room, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The world outside had witnessed a dramatic confrontation, but she understood that real change would require persistence. One courtroom, one viral video, one act of courage could inspire, but it could not, by itself, dismantle entrenched systems. And yet, as she reviewed the news clips, the messages of support, and the reactions from communities far beyond her city, she knew one truth: courage was contagious. And today, she had started an epidemic. The courtroom battle was over, but the war for accountability, fairness, and justice was just beginning. The days following the courtroom incident were anything but quiet. What had begun as a moment of defiance quickly escalated into a full-blown confrontation between her and the local law enforcement hierarchy. The officers involved were livid, their pride wounded by the viral video that captured their humiliation. Meetings behind closed doors were convened, strategies discussed, and internal memos circulated. They were determined to reclaim authority, to rewrite the narrative, and to punish what they saw as insubordination. But she was ready. Her calm, strategic mind had anticipated resistance. She had not acted impulsively in the courtroom, every move had been calculated, every step measured. She knew the importance of documentation, witnesses, and legal counsel. She had begun gathering statements from court staff, jurors, and bystanders who had observed the incident firsthand. Each testimony reinforced the same undeniable truth: the officers had overstepped their bounds. Legal filings soon followed. Complaints were submitted to oversight committees, formal reports demanded disciplinary action, and civil rights attorneys offered their support. Her aim was not revenge, it was accountability. She understood the fine line between asserting one's rights and provoking retaliation, and she navigated it with precision. Meanwhile, the officers attempted subtle forms of intimidation. Rumors circulated about potential charges against her for disrupting court proceedings. Supervisors hinted at internal investigations into her own behavior, framing her actions as unprofessional or reckless. But these attempts at retaliation only strengthened her resolve. With every baseless accusation, she documented evidence, recorded interactions, and built an airtight case. Public attention became her ally. Community members organized peaceful demonstrations in front of the courthouse, praising her courage and demanding transparency. Social media amplified the pressure, as hashtags urging accountability trended nationally. The combination of public scrutiny and meticulous legal preparation left the law enforcement agency with little room to maneuver. Her legal team also began to explore systemic reforms. Policies regarding officer conduct in courtrooms, proper use of authority, and citizen rights during proceedings were scrutinized. She wasn't just defending herself, she was catalyzing institutional change. Meetings with local advocacy groups and lawmakers were scheduled, ensuring that her courtroom act of defiance had tangible, long-lasting consequences. Despite the escalating tension, she maintained her routine. Her mornings began with research and strategy sessions, afternoons with meetings and interviews, and evenings with reflection and planning. Exhaustion was constant, but she understood that her mission required sustained focus. This wasn't a single victory, it was the beginning of a prolonged struggle for justice. Her resolve inspired others. Victims of similar abuses reached out, sharing stories that mirrored her own. Their voices added weight to her campaign, illustrating that the problem was systemic, not isolated. Together, they formed a coalition advocating for reform, leveraging media attention, and engaging with policymakers to propose concrete solutions. Internally, she also navigated personal doubts. The scrutiny, the pressure, and the potential risks of retaliation weighed heavily, but she reminded herself that courage is not the absence of fear, it is action in spite of it. Each challenge, each confrontation, was a test of resilience. And she had already proven she could rise to the occasion. By the end of the week, a formal review of the officer's conduct was underway. Administrative hearings had been scheduled, and the legal system could no longer ignore the incident. Her courtroom defiance had set in motion a chain of events that would reverberate far beyond that single day. One thing was clear, she had transformed from a lone voice of resistance into a figure of accountability and empowerment. The officers could attempt retaliation, the bureaucracy could stall, and critics could question her methods, but the momentum she had generated was unstoppable. Her fight was no longer just personal. It had become a movement. And every action, every strategy, and every act of courage would contribute to reshaping a system long resistant to change. The tension in the courthouse was palpable as the day of the formal hearing arrived. Journalists lined the halls, recording every moment, while advocacy groups filled the seats with supporters holding signs calling for accountability. Her presence commanded attention, not as a defendant, but as a catalyst for change. She had become the symbol of resistance, and everyone knew that this day would set a precedent. As she walked into the courtroom, the officers involved exchanged guarded glances. Their earlier confidence had been shaken, replaced with the anxiety of knowing their actions were being scrutinized under a public microscope. The judge, a seasoned veteran accustomed to courtroom dramas, tried to maintain neutrality, but even they could not ignore the tension radiating from the room. The proceedings began with formal statements. She and her legal team presented a meticulously prepared case, detailed accounts of the officers' actions, timelines corroborated by video footage, and sworn testimonies from multiple witnesses. Each point reinforced the undeniable fact that the physical altercation had been unwarranted and excessive. The officers' defense was predictable yet feeble. They claimed routine enforcement and argued that their actions were justified. But their narrative faltered under the weight of evidence. Video recordings clearly showed a disproportionate response, while witness statements consistently contradicted the officer's version of events. Attempts to intimidate or undermine her credibility were immediately challenged by her attorneys, leaving the courtroom buzzing with tension. At one point, frustration boiled over. One officer made a veiled threat, hinting at future reprisals, and the room collectively tensed. In that moment, she did something unprecedented. She stood and addressed the courtroom herself. Her voice, steady yet fierce, recounted her experience in vivid detail, not as an act of vengeance but as a declaration of truth. Every word was deliberate, highlighting systemic flaws in how authority is exercised and emphasizing the need for accountability. Her statement resonated. Even those on the fence were forced to reckon with the reality of her story. The judge, visibly moved, called for a brief recess to allow the tension to subside and to review evidence more closely. Outside the courtroom, supporters erupted in murmurs of encouragement, while critics fell silent, realizing that the narrative had shifted irreversibly. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere had transformed. The officers' defense appeared weaker, their previous bravado replaced with cautious hesitation. Her legal team pressed the issue further, proposing reforms and demanding disciplinary action. Each argument was reinforced with meticulous documentation, legal precedent, and public accountability. It became clear that the hearing was no longer about a single incident, it was about setting a broader standard for justice. By the end of the day, the judge announced preliminary findings. The officer's conduct had indeed violated protocols, and disciplinary measures would be enacted pending further review. Additionally, a recommendation for policy changes regarding courtroom conduct and citizen protections was forwarded to the appropriate authorities. While not a final victory, it was a clear acknowledgement that her courage had forced the system to confront its own failures. Walking out of the courtroom, she felt a mixture of relief and determination. The battle was far from over, but she had successfully turned a moment of personal defiance into a movement for systemic accountability. The ripple effects of that day would influence policy discussions, inspire others to speak out, and create a framework for change that could not easily be ignored. Her journey was no longer just about reclaiming her rights, it was about reclaiming justice itself. And as she stepped into the waiting crowd of supporters, she realized that her actions had not only transformed her own life but had also illuminated a path for countless others who had long been silenced. The aftermath of the courtroom showdown was immediate and intense. Within hours, news outlets had picked up the story, and social media erupted. Headlines ranged from celebratory to sensationalist, some praised her bravery, others attempted to frame her actions as reckless defiance of authority. She knew this was the price of challenging systemic injustice, but the sudden exposure still carried a shock that was hard to process. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Messages of support poured in from strangers, activists, and community leaders, praising her courage and vowing to stand alongside her. Yet interspersed with those messages were threats and harassment from people angered by her defiance. Trolls, critics, and even some in law enforcement tried to discredit her character, digging up every minor detail of her past to paint her as untrustworthy. But she refused to be silenced. Each message of hatred reminded her why this fight mattered. The media frenzy brought unexpected challenges. Reporters camped outside her home, following her movements, and cameras caught her in private moments she hadn't intended to share. Some news segments misrepresented the facts, focusing more on the spectacle of her taking the judge's seat than on the systemic issues she had highlighted. Her legal team worked tirelessly to correct misstatements, issuing clarifications and demanding accurate coverage. She learned quickly that public perception was just as much a battlefield as the courtroom. Her personal life was equally affected. Friends and family rallied around her, but the pressure was immense. Privacy became a luxury she no longer had. Every public appearance had to be calculated and deliberate, balancing the need for visibility with personal safety. Sleep was elusive, and every day brought new challenges, threats from anonymous callers, online harassment, and the constant need to navigate a world that had suddenly made her a symbol of resistance. Yet amid the chaos, something powerful emerged. She inspired action. Grassroots organizations reached out, asking her to speak at rallies, participate in panels, and advise on policy reforms. She became a mentor to others who had faced similar injustices, sharing strategies for confronting authority and navigating legal systems. Her story sparked conversations in schools, workplaces, and community centers, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, abuse of power, and the importance of standing up for justice. Despite the recognition, she never lost sight of the moment that started it all. The slap, the humiliation, the courage to reclaim authority in the courtroom, those events remained a touchstone for her resolve. Each day, she reminded herself that her actions were not about personal glory but about creating a safer, fairer system for everyone. That clarity gave her strength to endure the backlash and to keep pushing for meaningful change. Legal proceedings continued in parallel with the media storm. While the initial ruling favored accountability, further hearings were required to solidify reforms and enforce disciplinary actions. Her lawyers emphasized the need to stay focused, ensuring that the case would not be derailed by public opinion or political maneuvering. She learned the delicate balance of leveraging media attention to pressure authorities while avoiding distractions that could compromise the legal process. By the end of the week, the story had gone national. Interviews, panel discussions, and op-eds painted her as a symbol of courage, and while she appreciated the recognition, she remained grounded. This was not about fame, it was about systemic change. Every story told, every discussion sparked, was another step toward accountability, equity, and justice. As she prepared for the next phase of hearings, she stood resilient. The slap in the courtroom had been a moment of violence meant to intimidate her, but she had turned it into a catalyst for empowerment. And now, as the media spotlight continued to follow her every move, she embraced her role, not as a celebrity, but as a catalyst for justice, determined to ensure that the momentum she had created would not be lost. The courtroom had transformed from a place of intimidation into a stage for accountability. The events that had shocked the city weeks earlier culminated in a final hearing that felt almost surreal. Judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officials all understood the gravity of what had happened, not just the slap, but the statement she had made by taking the judge's seat. This was no longer about a single incident, it had become a test of justice, integrity, and societal values. The presiding judge, now acutely aware of public scrutiny, addressed the courtroom with solemnity. Every word seemed carefully measured, recognizing the broader implications of the case. Her legal team presented detailed evidence of misconduct, supported by eyewitness testimonies, video recordings, and expert analysis. The focus was not vengeance but systemic reform, implementing safeguards to prevent abuse of authority, mandating accountability measures, and ensuring that victims of such misconduct could seek justice without fear. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered, reflecting a community energized and emboldened by her courage. Activists, journalists, neighbors, and ordinary citizens filled the steps of the courthouse, holding signs that read messages of solidarity, justice over intimidation, power with accountability, and courage wins. The atmosphere was electric, a testament to how a single act of defiance had galvanized a movement. As the final verdict was read, the courtroom held a collective breath. The judge ruled decisively, the officers involved were held accountable, disciplinary actions were enforced, and several policy reforms were mandated. The ruling was historic, not only for her case but for its precedent-setting potential nationwide. Law enforcement agencies and courts alike were now under renewed pressure to uphold ethical standards and respect the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or status. For her, the victory was deeply personal yet larger than herself. Sitting in the courtroom, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the fear, the anger, the humiliation, and ultimately, the courage to take control of a situation designed to oppress her. Each moment of resistance had built toward this triumph, a testament to her resilience and determination. She knew that change rarely came without confrontation, and in standing up for herself, she had stood up for countless others who had suffered in silence. The media coverage shifted from spectacle to substance. Stories highlighted the reforms enacted, the courageous individuals advocating for justice, and the importance of confronting systemic bias. She became a spokesperson for reform, not seeking fame but leveraging her visibility to promote meaningful, lasting change. Community organizations, policymakers, and educators reached out, asking her to advise on programs designed to train officers, prevent misconduct, and educate the public about civil rights. Even as her life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, she understood that the fight for justice was ongoing. Each policy change, each court reform, was a step forward, but the broader goal of equity and accountability required vigilance, persistence, and courage. She committed herself to this cause, knowing that her actions had sparked a movement that could not be reversed. In the end, the slap in the courtroom became a symbol of defiance and empowerment. What had been intended as a moment of humiliation transformed into a catalyst for systemic change, showing that courage could disrupt injustice and even the most entrenched institutions. Her legacy was no longer just about one courtroom incident, it was about the enduring principle that standing up for justice, even against formidable odds, could alter the course of history. She left the courthouse that day not as a victim, not as a figure of controversy, but as a leader, an inspiration, and a testament to the power of resilience. The city had witnessed her courage, the nation had taken notice, and countless lives had been touched. Justice, she realized, was not a passive ideal, it was an active pursuit, one she had helped redefine. And with that, she stepped forward into a future she had fought to shape, ready to continue the work that the slap had ignited, a fight for fairness, dignity, and the unwavering belief that one person could make a difference.